My name is Rick Manzanares. I hear told all the time in this area, I'm not from here. But it's really important, that whole thing about being from here. I was born in Mora County in New Mexico. I was actually born in a tuberculosis center. My mother was a maid, and I guess it's not a big secret in my family. I was born out of wedlock, so she was working really hard as a maid, and she had a little apartment there at the as an employee, and so I was born by a midwife. And then I grew up with Grandma Beatriz at 20 miles south of Wagon Mound, and this really dirt farming, dirt ranching. And I stayed with her till 7 years old, and she that was my parent essentially, and she died when I was 7, so that was like losing my parent at that point. And that's when I moved to southern Colorado, the Manzanola area there. I the rest of my time in school was there, and so that's where I graduated, etc. But those 7 years that I spent with my grandmother were so fundamental for me. They've probably saved my life many, many times. They're just, I keep going back to those values and all that. And we had a few families around there, but we were essentially 20 miles from even the little village. So only Spanish was spoken. My grandmother had very little English. It was very peaceful there. We didn't have the indoor plumbing. We didn't have light. I thought we were rich, but we were in many ways. But then right in the same house was my aunt and her 2 daughters and son. So we had an extended family situation right in the same house, which is very common in New Mexico. You just kind of add a room and when the new family starts up. And so I went to Wagon Mound schools for a couple of years, and the transition from Spanish to English was seamless because our teachers were in the same boat. They spoke Spanish, and so they brought us along. A young kid like that can learn a language very easily, so it wasn't that difficult for me. When I went to Manzanola is when issues started about language. I was told in school immediately, because I'm sure I spoke Spanish to somebody, and they said, no, that's not allowed on school grounds, and you'll be sent to the office if we hear you speaking it. And I thought, what's wrong with my language? what did I do? But that was hard getting used to. My grandmother was so steeped in religion, and we prayed rosaries every night, and they lasted an hour, because everybody that she knew that ever died had to have a special prayer for him. So it just went on and on. I'm sure I fell asleep several times, but we had a big old potbelly heater in the middle of the bedroom, and so it's nice and cozy, but we had to pray, and it was just very strict. Lent was very strict. Remember going to Morada when I was maybe 5 or 6, and I fell asleep. Kids fall asleep. But what woke me up was all this racket and singing and lights going on and off. It scared the heck out of me for years and years and years. That's the memory I had of Morada. And I said, oh, those people are kind of different. I don't know. It wasn't until it came to San Luis that I was able to see what that was about. And of course, it's tinieblas, the very moment that Jesus dies on the cross. And what the Bible tells us is there was thunder and lightning, and and that's what they're recreating with the matracas and everything else. And it's a beautiful service. But back then, I didn't think it was so beautiful. So those are my roots. I mean, my grandma is so special to me, but I lost her so long ago. I have a few memories, but her knowledge of Spanish, like I said, was not good. We had a rancher that came by, Anglo rancher, and of course he had some rudimentary Spanish, and my grandfather's name was Manuel. And so he comes in and he says, "Donde está Manuel?" And my grandmother says, "Se fue para casa Carlos." And to her, she thought she was mastering the English language, but it's a story we told over and over. But it's indicative of the kind of English that she knew, and you just change the accent a little, and they're going to understand. Of course, he understood, but my grandmother thought she was speaking English. Poor thing.
What are some other? I just want to kind of venture back into that house and your grandmother and your kin. What were some of the other cultural things that you remember? Like in terms of meals and just the different things that you saw around you.
And I've talked to other people, and they tell similar stories. We had a big holding tank for our water, very fresh water. We had a molino, and the water came up very cold and fresh. I remember we loved making Kool-Aid out of it, and it was a treat. So that's the water we got when we wanted to drink, cook, and also the water that we needed to heat up for our probably weekly baths, I don't know. And you took a bath right in front of the stove, and they put chairs around so they could cover and give you a little privacy. But for a kid, they didn't care much. The meals were, they were basic. We had the best red chili and the best frijoles and pozole and all of that stuff. And bizcochitos were very, very special. We had to go pick the small pieces of wood, and if we did that, Grandma would make bizcochitos. She made prune squares, all of that stuff. It was stuff I still enjoy eating. Again, there was a lot of prayer. I remember when it was dry, we would take our santos and we would go around the country, around the area there, holding our santos, praying for rain and singing whatever songs that we sang at the time. And, that was really or my uncles were in the war. She'd do that too. It was a form of more devotion. And sometimes she knelt down to pray on the country. I had a cow named Pinta, and she was a dairy cow. So she gave me a lot of calves and all that. And then I had a horse named Smokey, and of course dogs and goats and sheep and everything else. But our meat was a lot of mutton, which I didn't particularly like that flavor to this day. I don't eat a lot of mutton. I'm not even crazy about lamb, but we slaughtered, the animals. We slaughtered sheep, and we slaughtered chickens a lot, and sometimes cows. Carne seca and, the choke cherry and all that. That's all part of growing up there. And we made our own games. We sometimes I get toys, or my cousin who was older, he liked wood a lot, so he would make some wooden toys. Oh, I was in heaven. I'd take those things all around the house and all kinds of stuff. But you have to, you kind of make up your own games, and they're fun. They're just, they're not a video game. They're just, hey, your imagination is fine, And we take long walks sometimes. They pulled the Llorona thing on us quite a bit. Although I think they called it a Coco Man. And one time we started getting real there's no Coco Man, you're just making that up kind of thing. I'm sure we didn't say it that disrespectfully, but so one night they got an uncle or a neighbor, I don't know, to come with a sheet over his head, and just we were terrified. And I think I went under the bed or something, and but they wanted, I'm not crazy about the Llorona, but I understand she kept people in line. She kept kids in line. Probably especially girls. You don't want to be out too late, and that was a good way to kind of. And we were told spooky stories all the time by my aunt, and oh, that owl over there last night was talking to me, and really? And I say that now, but there was a lot of superstition, a lot of stories, a lot of, and when the sun went down, you wanted to be in the house. But Christmas, we did Mis Christmas a lot. They do that in San Francisco here in San Luis, but I don't know if it's still alive in many other places. It's very much like Halloween. You take your little bucket around or your bag and you go to your neighbors and Mis Christmas, and they give you apples, and mostly apples and candy and nuts. We had velorios there when someone died, but we also had celebrations, and they'd go on into the night. The community would come and everybody would bring their wonderful pies and food and all that, and it wasn't very often, but it happened. The roads were not so good out there. We had a old pickup truck to get back into town once or twice a month, but to get to church we used horse and buggy because there was trails instead of roads, and we went to church. We all had our individual benches, probably made by the family, and you sat on those benches. Those were your benches. And so, but the priest wouldn't come so often either. It's so remote that maybe, I don't know if we went once a week or not. I think maybe we went once a month to church. That's kind of a little bit of flavor of what was going on there.
Do you ever remember getting sick or people getting sick, and like what times remedios and different things were?
I remember this thing called empache, and it's when you're kind of bloated in your stomach or something, and they would put a candle on your body and light it, and then put a glass over it, and then just kind of work your stomach or your back or whatever. And I still don't know what that cures, but that was one of the remedios. We did go to the doctor, but it was 40 miles. And so you better not be too sick. It was kind of, once we were playing doctor nurse or doctor patient with my cousins, and they gave me my grandfather's pills, and I took them, and ended up having to go to the doctor to get pumped. But that was I got yelled at. But anyway, that's kind of, you know what? It was idyllic for me. Those years were idyllic. And so when I joined my other family, my mom and my stepfather, and 3 brothers and sisters already, and I became the oldest brother, it was a real shock. It was a life-changing thing for me because I wasn't ready for that. I loved my time in New Mexico. So when I came here to work at the museum, I just felt like I came home. There was so many similarities to the language, although I noticed that some of the people my own age were not using it so much. And I remember my good friend Emerita Romero Anderson, who's deceased unfortunately, a wonderful friend. I'd use some of the old Spanish, and she said, "Oh, you talk like the old people." I said, "That's because I'm from New Mexico. We still use those terms." But so they've lost a little bit of that here, but I'm sure by now in New Mexico they have too. But Mis Christmas, like I said, goes on. We did Posadas, that goes on too. The kind of foods that we eat they're the same, essentially. I just don't see that huge of a difference between the village customs there and here. And I'm talking about, I have not been very much in the Conejos little towns, but I have in Costilla County where, El Rito or San Francisco and those villages all seem very similar to me. And I love when Posadas come because I drive all the way down there and participate. They do the whole 9 nights. Each church has their own night to host a part of the novena, which is what it is. We didn't have acequias. We didn't have that, unfortunately, where I lived. Obviously, lots of acequias in New Mexico, but We're more like dry land farming, and we had our own well, and so there was a limitation as to how much you could grow and how many cattle you could sustain. And we normally had 25 to 30. We didn't have a lot, and those kind of kept us going.
You mentioned the acequia system. What was the role and the importance of the acequia system in the Hispanic communities in this area?
The word acequia is actually an Arab word. That system of gravity-driven irrigation, they brought it to Spain. And where you have dry lands that depend on one body of water, you have to come up with a system that will support that. And so when they brought it to southern Spain, then that came over here to New Mexico and southern Colorado. I'd done enough reading to know that it was a system that was sustaining their villages. So it's when you hear the words centuries old, it's not an exaggeration. There's an obvious role, and that is to nurture your plants. It's not only about acequias, it's about everything else and your family and taking care of each other and keeping in touch with each other, communicating, and really providing a glue for a community. So that's why they talk about acequia culture, because it's really a village culture. And the acequias are so necessary. They're the lifeblood, but they also provide all this other glue for everything that goes on in the community. And of course, there's tension. There's also tension there. There's, water is, as you all know, has become such a precious, precious gift. And so everybody wants to get enough of their water, enough, what they've got coming. And so sometimes there's little discussions about, hey, you got too much this time. But okay, that's fine. It's the way it works. And if you're not there the day you're supposed to be there to clean, I so much respect those pacientes that are hanging on to that water, because it takes that communal water. It takes each one of them to not sell out and, maybe sacrifice quite a bit so that we can keep our water in our little communities. One starts selling out, and then I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in southeastern Colorado, where an entire county went dry, and they're being sustained by 2 prisons. There's just no agriculture left in that county. It's Crowley County. And Otero County started doing the same thing. So they have to start coming up with solutions as to how to keep our small ranchers and farmers in their their farms, and how to pass it on. Where's the succession and all that? Those are so critical right now. This is what's going on right now, and so we are in danger of losing that whole lifestyle, that agricultural lifestyle. Talk about the dynamics of, we don't want you to sell out, or if you sell to your family, or find a succession thing. So we have to look at some modern tools now, like easements. I know they're kind of, people don't want to hear about it, but there's a lot of creative ways to keep the land and water for ranching and farming. And so we maybe have to, although we have an ancient water system and it's precious, goes back to the Arabs, maybe we need to start looking at some modern technology to make sure we keep it. Because, as you know, laws change, times change, and in Colorado there's incredible amount of attention being paid to water. It's, forget oil. We need to think about water and water rights. As Colorado, the Front Range, is getting overpopulated, they need water, and they're looking at places like the San Luis Valley to get it. And that will kill the San Luis Valley if they have a wholesale. And so these pacientes are very, very strong about keeping their acequias. There's more involved than watering your fields. It's the economy of the village the agriculture is the economy, and so there has to be this give and take. It keeps people engaged with each other. You can't living in one of those villages. You really can't be that independent. You are independent to an extent. You got your own thoughts and all that, but you really, really need each other there. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that they need each other. Sometimes they don't like each other, but they need each other. I think the acequias are central. And that's why, we have congresos, we have an association and all that. So it's that important. Where do we have acequias? Very few places. In our, I don't know if they have them in Conejos, for instance. I'm sure they have some. Mm-hmm. And Costilla, and then you get out of those counties, and you have a lot of the other type of irrigation that is not as efficient and as conservation-wise as an acequia is. It just comes right back into the river or the waterway.
You also mentioned some tensions that happen in the villages. There's a lot of historical, racial, and ethnic tensions that have happened all over the valley. Can you talk about some of the things that might have contributed to those types of tensions?
Well, you have to dig a little deep here because I think that tensions in our DNA sometimes it comes from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo when we lost all our land essentially. I mean the treaty promised so much that we were going to be able to hold on to lands and water and all that stuff, and you use a different jurisdictional system that like the United States had versus what we had, which is more communal and more based on land grant thinking and process. Well, just the language alone was enough to take a lot of the land. And then shortly after the treaty, they wanted Hispanics to pay taxes. And if you read about the Espinoza brothers, that became an issue there. That's one of the reasons that they supposedly went berserk. Well, I'm not going to buy that one yet. We're still doing some work on that. But, okay, not only do you start taking our land and water and everything, but now you want us to pay taxes. And we've never paid them. We most of the time operated on the barter system, or there was very little so-called money. And so a lot of it was barter system and all that. And then you come to a community that's asset rich and money poor, then you find ways to, hey, you don't have enough money to pay your taxes, etc. So that's the seed. Now that's so it goes on for generations where there's this resentment, and then you have different people moving into the area, Anglos, people from Europe wanting to buy land and then resell it for big prices, etc. So where's the trust level when all that is going on? Hispanics are looking at them, my gosh, these guys that's all they want is to take what we have. And so, of course, there's going to be tension towards these people, and that gets passed on. And another group that moved in were the Mormons, and they have a different way of looking at life, and they were different from us, and they still are, and we're just beginning to take a look at that, and we don't talk about it. I was at a conference yesterday about branding in the San Luis Valley, and it was almost noon before anybody even mentioned Hispanics. And I said, excuse me, I have something to say. And then it opened up the discussion, and then people were engaging with each other. I think sometimes people are afraid to talk. How do we work together as communities? How do you respect these communities like San Luis that people say they're mistrustful. Well, yeah, because they've had so much done to them, so much taken away from them. So again, it's in the DNA. The kid at the school is going to tell you they don't trust, and they're not always sure why, but they know that they've lost a lot.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience both at the museum in Fort Garland and kind of what was going on there, and how you changed the way in terms of the reenactments and things like that, and then just your thoughts on the Espinosa brothers in general?
They're a symbol. They're a symbol of the tension that was out in the open between Hispanics and the military. Fort Garland soldiers were out there patrolling, and they were coming in to help collect taxes, etc. So those are the communities were very scared and angry, etc. Now, I don't have a psychological profile of the Espinosas and the nephew that ended up supposedly doing all these killings. And a lot of the newspaper articles of the time call them terrorists and built on maybe one murder and blaming another murder. They say it was 32 or 33 murders, and they're the most prolific murderers in the history of Colorado. And yet we haven't delved into each one of those cases to find out, where'd you get this? Now, we're told that the Espinosas had a journal of some sort, and supposedly it burned in the archives. I don't know. So all we have are these newspapers that were very, very mistrustful of the Hispanic community, very much so. And it was very easy for them to take this example of a murderer and really spread it to what the character of Hispanics were. And that's kind of what makes me interested in this case. I'm not so much interested in the grueling chopping of the heads and all that came later, but I'm more interested in the context, what's going on at that time and so I looked for publications of churches or other publications of the time that maybe were in Spanish to get some sort of a different perspective. I didn't find them. I don't know that they exist. They might actually exist, but I didn't find them. I went to Santa Fe and looked in the archives, and so I next resorted to talking to descendants. And every descendant said that the story just doesn't hold. That's not the way it happened. Now, unfortunately, there's variations. Oh, how you tell somebody something, and by the time it gets to the fifth person, it's already changed quite a bit and embellished. But what I do think is some things hold true, and that it was a great injustice on the Espinosas to begin with. And if there was murders, and I think there were some, they were retaliating and they were defending themselves, because there was a huge manhunt to try to capture these guys. Were they madmen? I don't think so. And here's another thing that really the newspapers of the time were reporting. They were members of the Penitente Brotherhood. And so they pulled out Charles Loomis's photography, where there's actually a crucifixion going on. I'm sure there was, but it wasn't nails and all that. It was an enactment, and that got published in a lot of places. I think the chieftain published it at one time. So you have those photos, and Charles Loomis, who just really, really did a disservice to history. But you look at that, and then so the newspapers are saying they're part of a violent lay Catholic organization. These people have a propensity. I'm paraphrasing. They have a propensity towards violence, and so therefore, the penitentes spawned their idea of killing Anglos, and they hated Anglos, etc. And it was a very secret brotherhood and all that. So how you tie that together is amazing. And based on the interviews I did with descendants, again, it holds a little bit true that that the story has not been told, and those stories, the yellow journalism that went on with the Rocky Mountain News and other newspapers of the time. This is in 1863, by the way. Are horrible. They take us all on. They take the entire Hispanic community on, and so they want that movie. They want to sensationalize it. They want to write these stories. It sells. I don't want to sell a story. I want to find out what happened.
So you mentioned the soldiers from Fort Garland patrolling and going out into communities. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's a side of this history that most people haven't heard, and the injustices that these folks these Hispanic settlers in these different villages, what were some of the injustices that they were facing?
Well, what that story tells us about Espinoza is a little bit. We don't have a lot of documentation about what they were doing, because again, from their perspective, they were just, hey, we got to go out and collect taxes from these new people. But what I do know from that time is that there was an incredible amount of mistrust. So the fort was set up to protect the villagers from the Utes, but there's a second part of that story. There was just tension, and they were being occupied. These folks were being, the land was being occupied. New rules are being made up. So I don't have a lot of stories about soldiers actually collecting the taxes, but the Espinoza story tells us that they were. Supposedly, there's a story that they were captured and taken to Fort Garland. That I have not been able to prove. At the time, they had a couple of commanders who were completely inept. They were drunks, and that fort had just gotten to be so lackadaisical because there wasn't a whole lot of things for them to do. But again, the dynamics between the Hispanic community, sometimes they were good, and a lot of times they weren't. The soldiers became enforcers for tax collection and a police force, if you will, when there was conflicts. So I don't think that. 63 is not that far from the 1848. So there's still a lot of bad feelings out there, a lot of mistrust. So I don't have a lot of information on that. But from that research, that comes out that they were out there collecting taxes, and they were helping trying to capture them after that first incident. And they obviously didn't capture them, or if they did and brought them in, they got away. I haven't been able to document that yet. It's got to be in the archives.
And my understanding is they were living in San Rafael at the time.
Yes, they were. Yeah, which is. For those that don't know, is in Conejos County. It's one of the small little communities there. There is a lot of goodness that comes out of our culture. We have a lot of traditions that are, conserve water, conserve land, conserve values, if you will, and they're worth holding on to. And so this proliferation of everything else in the society is hard. That's what we're not fighting it. We're trying to put that in context. And our young kids are not learning the language that we'd like them to. And there are pockets. I know in New Mexico there's pockets of places that that maintain some semblance of language and tradition. That sense of identity, that sense, my grandmother gave something to me, and I want to keep that and possibly pass it on to whoever I can, And so, and I think it's just we're a valid culture within the dominant culture, and we have a lot to offer. That's why it's worth saving.